I love video games. Video games are my #1 source of entertainment. They are also great mediums for me to escape my tiresome routines. If I am bored, if I am stressed, if life is trying to destroy me and rip me to shreds, video games manage to put me back up together and life feels fresh and colorful again. The thing is, despite how important they are for me, I have never actually seen them as anything beyond entertainment. I don't think of video games as this grandiose of art. Sure, they are culturally significant, but that's because they are fun. Video games become a pop culture phenomenon, banking millions and millions of dollars, more so than any other entertainment media combined, because they are fun to play and people enjoy them. So game journalists, I want to ask you a question. What do you see in video games? I see video games as entertainment. I see video games as pure escapism. But you want video games to be something more. You want video games to mean something to you. Well, is being fun and entertaining meaningful enough for you? It's meaningful enough for me, especially after I find out that I got another C- in my college assignment. In the last video, I've talked about how game journalists are disappointed that Far Cry 5 doesn't talk about current American politics. And even to this day, I still have no idea why. The game doesn't have to talk about current American politics in order to be fun. And yes, I did have fun with Far Cry 5, albeit with a couple of issues I talked about in another video. So now I want to get into an article from PC Gamer titled, "Let's Talk About Politics in Games." Okay, PC Gamer, let's talk about them. Oh, and before we get to that, huge thanks to Janelle Rambo for the pledge on Patreon. You are fantastic. So the article begins by talking about Far Cry 5 and talking about how video games have more detailed societies to explore, like in Mass Effect, BioShock, and even in some political simulator games. There are also games with more overt political themes like Papers, Please and Democracy. Okay, before we move on, I just want to point out that Papers, Please is an excellent game that doesn't shove the politics down your throat. The politics in the game are entirely within the fictional context and not a contemporary reference of some sort. Same can be said to Far Cry 5, Mass Effect, and BioShock actually. More on the first one and less on Infinite. Most of the political themes being handled by these games are within their own fictional context. The article then proceeds to talk about how any mentions of politics in relations to gaming produces a divisive reaction. A lot of readers find interesting, but plenty of others react with fury, with the phrase "shoved down people's throat" appearing quite a lot. Now there's a very good reason for this, namely because the sorts of people who brings up politics in video games have some downright questionable arguments. For example, a journalist from Vice is talking about how there are way too many black people in Far Cry 5. What kind of discussion that you're trying to invite here? What is this criticism? What is this argument? Another reason is the people who bring up these topics, they usually run away from discussions by the time they are confronted about it. Here's a writer from The Verge responding to someone who complained about her disabling the comment section on her recent article. "I don't believe having an opinion on the internet should inherently mean opening yourself to abuse and vulgarity. I also don't believe this has to stifle discourse, only that it makes choices about what it immediately invites. This is, in part, the point of what I wrote." This is an interesting response. From the way you talk about abuse and vulgarity, you are implying that every comment made towards you will be guaranteed abuse and vulgarity. The reason why I find this interesting is because I wonder what article that she wrote that has a high chance of abuse and vulgarity. Turns out it's an article talking about how Ready Player One is a digital roadmap to Cyber Dystopia. It's a pretty freaking insane article. It's way too long and I don't know where to begin to illustrate the utter lunacy of it. I welcome you to read this article yourself. The writer doesn't disable comments because she's afraid of abuse. She disabled the comments because of pure arrogance. She wants to air her opinions in public and not have people to counter her points. She farts in a room and then runs away. This is quite ironic because a lot of times these people also want to talk about how to punish people for having the wrong opinions. They are not afraid of giving consequences to other people for having wrong opinions, but they are afraid of receiving consequences for their own opinions. Blatant hypocrisy, pure arrogance, all illustrated in one convenient package. Do you want more reasons why people become divisive when they talk about politics in video games? I assure you, PC Gamer, on that topic alone, we can go for hours. But let's go back to the topic of politics in video games. So from there, the article turns into a discussion transcript from 3 individuals. That's a really nice way to spice things up. So we get different perspectives from different people, right? Not exactly.
There's a conception that games are devoid of real cultural significance. They are just games and shouldn't be taken seriously. But the opposite is true. The everyday is far more important than the extraordinary.
And here's where I disagree. I'm on the mindset that games are just entertainment. They are my favorite entertainment, and I play them quite a lot throughout my 20 years living on this earth, but in the end, they are still entertainment. So when I say they are just games, I really do mean it. Even if they are my favorite games of all time, even if they have a great story and deep philosophical themes that we can discuss for hours, they are still video games. They are still entertainment. My favorite games are the ones that embrace this. They don't care about the maturity of the medium, they don't care about saying something meaningful, they only care about being entertaining. The most culturally significant games of our time are culturally significant because they embrace the fact that they are just video games. It's the reason why people love to play them. Super Mario wouldn't have been a culturally significant game if it wasn't fun. Doom wouldn't have been a culturally significant game if it wasn't fun. Game developers need to understand what video games are. They are, in the end, made for people's entertainment. People need to find something entertaining from it. Otherwise, it would fail.
If you were to dissect Charles Dickens' novel and say, too bad these popular 19th century English novels tell us nothing about the 19th century English culture or politics, you'd surely be missing something. The stuff produced by a studio, person, country, or era necessarily reflects the time in which it was made.
You don't go into video games to be lectured about politics. That Charles Dickens comparison implies that you want video games to in some ways lecture you or educate you about the time period of when it was made, or maybe any other political topics that are relevant on the time. How and why? You can talk about the history of Pong and contextualize how the game came into fruition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the game itself lectures us about it. And unlike Charles Dickens, video games aren't there to give lectures about, for example, your past, your present, your future. Okay, sometimes they do, but they do them to characters in the fictional world for their character arc, not to you. Except maybe when you're playing Seaman on Dreamcast?
In general, would you describe yourself as a confident person? You don't have to be perfect to still be able to like yourself.
Good God, I did pronounce it as Seaman.
I think you're right about the lasting perception that games are toys, and therefore don't carry meaning in the same way as a film or a novel. In some cases, this might be true. It's hard to draw any political themes or commentary out of my current obsession, Slay the Spire, a game about playing cards to beat the crap out of goblins.
Well, there's someone who understands. You can't exactly draw politics out of even the most mundane of things.
For starters, the fantasy genre popularized within 19th and 20th century colonial powers, namely England, often pits human or human-like races against evil, inhuman races, which there is an obvious political quality to, if you ask me. Read The Princess and the Goblin, which inspired Tolkien's Goblins, and so most after, and you'll find that it is not politically inert at all.
You are unusually knowledgeable about this, Tyler.
Now I imagine Slay the Spire just wanted to throw some scary fantasy monsters at us, but in answering the question, what could be political about beating up goblins, I could probably expand forever.
Ah, so this is how game journalists make articles. Find something that is clearly not political in any way, shape, or form, and make insane leaps of logic after another to actually make it political. Those clicks must have been very good.
I'll be honest, when I play a game with goblins, I'm not really thinking about their socio-economic status or why humans are beating them up. That goes for a lot of people looking for escapism in games. I think we're not all deep thinkers like you, Tyler.
I don't know, deep thinker is way too nice to describe that. Overthinker more like.
But you make a great point. When someone labels something as just a game, they willfully ignore the history behind that game's themes. That history was shaped by culture and politics. Even if the developers of the game were oblivious to that history when they made it, it's still there.
And you have to point them all out?
One of the ways we approach evaluating a game is to consider how successful it is at what it set out to do. If customers saw Far Cry 5's marketing and bought it anticipating some political ideas, it's worth pointing out the absence of that, without holding that against the amount of fun you're likely to have with the game.
Oh, I see. So it's worth pointing out the absence of political ideals in Far Cry 5 to the customers who expected them in the game? Now that makes sense. Thank you, PC Gamer, for giving me the answer. So now I'm going to ask the question, who exactly are the sorts of people who expect political commentaries out of Far Cry 5? Are these people desperate enough to have their viewpoints about evil conservative Christian Trump voters validated that they have to beg for video games to give them that confirmation? Actually, it's a lot less begging and more expecting that they're going to be there, although I can certainly see a lot of begging in my first Far Cry 5 video. The article then proceeds to talk about Metal Gear Solid, whose politics and opinions about nuclear bomb and war I frankly do not care at all. Metal Gear Solid is not exactly stellar in its story department, and for the record, Metal Gear Solid 3 is one of my favorite games of all time.
What's more important to me is pushing back against the idea that games shouldn't be political, and the anger and hate developers get for caring about issues like diversity and representation.
Ryder, there are so many people who are critical of diversity and representation. I suggest you to go talk to them. Don't worry, they won't bite. Or if you think that they will, at least try to talk to me, because I certainly won't.
It's a crappy attempt by some people to narrowly define what games are or should be because they are personally uncomfortable with the world changing. They want games to purely be an escape, not something that challenges their worldview.
Stop. No. I don't want video games to challenge my worldview. I want video games to purely be an escape. If I want to challenge my worldview, I would be reading your article or talk to people that I disagree with, which is something that you should really do, especially to the critics of diversity and representation. I don't trust you when you say that it can be used as a way of challenging people's worldview. It's almost like you're using video games as a big megaphone for your political beliefs rather than a medium of entertainment. Can video games truly challenge one's belief? Even my favorite games of all time do not challenge my beliefs of certain things. They can provide good ideas, they can potentially be challenging to some people, but they're just not challenging for me.
There is something to be said for games as an apolitical space, though. Games like sport can be a place where people with very different views can come together and find a common ground.
Agreed. This is how video games are supposed to be.
Escapism itself has political implications. What are you escaping from? And the act of creating a game also relates to politics. You can't get away from it, but you can, of course, play games uncritically. I'm not thinking about fossil fuels while grabbing boost in Rocket League. I'm just playing some Rocket League because I am tired and the day sucked and I want to tune out. How could I judge anyone for doing the same?
Tyler, I think you have already answered your question in what you are escaping from.
I am generalizing here, but I feel like far more people get up in arms about LGBTQ characters being forced into games than they do Metal Gear Solid taking a political stance.
If you cannot see the reason why, maybe you should talk to those people who are critical of diversity and representation. If you don't want to ask them, then maybe I can make a video game that challenges your worldview. Actually, I don't have to. Someone already did that this year with a game called Kingdom Come Deliverance, and people complain about how there are way too many white people in there. I think the one great part about Kingdom Come Deliverance is how it challenges the viewpoints of game journalists in that history is pretty freaking white in the 14th century of Bohemia. And for some reason, game journalists cannot accept them. So there, we made a game that challenged your worldview and people like you still complain for some reason.
Right. Illustrates how the distinction between what is political and what is apolitical is an illusion. How could it be that CSGO, where you play as a terrorist or counter-terrorist trying to plant or defuse a bomb, is viewed by many as apolitical, while any game that happens to feature a queer character, something far more ordinary, is branded as political, or simply SJW?
The answer is pretty simple. It's because of you. I don't see you complaining about CSGO. I do see you complain about the lack of LGBT characters in video games. You are constantly parading for more games to have more LGBT characters because of the stupidest of reasons. The reasons can range from it's current year to straight people don't exist. No, seriously. So remember when Waypoint talked about how Atlas mishandled the LGBT characters in Persona, even though it was Waypoint who misrepresented the characters? People get up in arms about LGBT characters in video games because 1, they are shoehorned in, 2, they're looking for it in a place where they don't actually exist, and 3, they woefully misrepresented the characters to a ridiculous degree.
The answer is that the actual purpose of calling a game political is to categorize other games as apolitical, and that is done to support certain often unacknowledged worldviews, such as that the war on terror is undebatable, correct, moral, while the personhood of certain people is debatable, political.
That's an interesting theory. So people call one game political so that they categorize other games as apolitical to support a certain worldview? I think you have issues, Tyler. You have issues in overthinking things that don't really need any sorts of overthinking.
I think about that whenever someone says we've got to get politics out of games and then hops into CSGO or whatever. How can one imagine that fighting terrorists has no political quality, that it's meaningless?
Because it is meaningless in the context of CSGO. The terrorists are meaningless. They are just there to serve as your opponents or as yourself, depending in who you chose to play as. They are just there as things to shoot. I don't know how else am I going to explain this to you. So in conclusion, whether video games are artistic or high art, they are at the very least fun. That's why I love them. That's why they become important parts of my life. That's why they are my #1 hobby. But I don't think of video games as something beyond than just entertainment. And that brings me to you, game journalists. How do you see video games? Do you see video games as escapism? Something to challenge other people's worldview? Or maybe even both? If so, why do video games need to challenge other people's worldview when, in my opinion, you can just do that by making articles or having conversations with people? I think game journalists really should have more conversations with people that they disagree with. Going out of your comfort zone can be pretty cool sometimes. Did you know that I used to really not like JRPGs? I think people can change, and I think you can do too. One of the great ways for us to change is if we step out of our comfort zones once in a while. If you don't want to change, that is perfectly fine. I mean, I can certainly understand the appeal of staying in your house, locking your doors, and playing with your Seaman. I think understand is the wrong word.